Good morning, everybody. We have the pleasure to talk before lunch, so this is going to be exciting. So hopefully you're feeling a bit hungry, because then you are thirsty for information as well. So we have three sort of growth champions from different stages of growth, starting from startup scene. Kim Väisänen, angel investor, still chairman of the board of Finnish Business Angel Network, correct?
That's correct.
Then we have Ville Koskenvuo, partner from Vaaka Partners, the most active private equity house in Finland, I would say. Is that right?
Maybe.
Yeah, we'll see.
Sometimes.
Yes. And then obviously Kris from Wolt. And how was the surname supposed to be pronounced? Peter was asking that.
It wasn't too bad. It's Beyens.
Beyens, okay, brilliant. Very good. Now let's start. I mean, we have a number of topics and very limited time. That's like life in growth company. But let's start with people. I have sort of a personal background. Back in the day, started as a CFO in a startup company. I was the 8th employee. Now let's start with Kim. I mean, now looking at the startups where you operate, do you think that every startup needs a CFO, or when do you actually start to sort of build a CFO office, and when you do, what sort of people, what sort of talent, what sort of capabilities are you looking for?
Yeah, I think it's actually I remember when you were CFO, and it's great that you are CEO nowadays.
I wasn't pretty good CFO, that's correct.
Yeah, he approached me in I think 99 or 2000, and he was like one of those mafiosos and came to me and, I want to buy your company. I wasn't willing to sell, fortunately. The thing is that when a company starts, in most cases, it doesn't have any incoming revenue. And CFOs, or if it's a financial manager or controller's role is like that, like, dude, where is my country? Like he or she can tell that how much money we have today. And that's more or less only task, or if we have any money. and then when it evolves, it comes more and more forecasting that hey, where the business is heading and what we forecast for the future and so forth. But I think that there's 4 key roles in any startup or scale up, so that you have a CEO who says more or less where we're heading. Then you should have someone who's involved with the HR, human resources, who we are going to recruit. And then the third is the CFO, and the fourth is the salesperson. But normally it is the managing director, CEO, which tries to do all the things, and in most cases does not manage to do any of those well. And I'm a perfect example of that. And then my third employee was CFO.
Third. Oh, that's brilliant. Now, Ville, now turning into sort of the private equity scene, where obviously the companies are slightly more, if not advanced, more mature maybe. So I would assume that each of your portfolio companies has a CFO, right? So,
yeah.
And when you are looking for CFOs in the private equity scene, what you are really looking for? What sort of character, what sort of qualities? Is it the same as in sort of startup scene? Obviously, you've invested into startups that have grown. Is that sort of, are the same qualities still valid, or does it change?
Yeah, I think it really depends on kind of each company and at which stage those companies are, and what do they need for the kind of whatever next 5 years. And we have a kind of maturity model, kind of 5 steps on it, and it really depends on where the company starts, that what does it need to get to the next steps. That's kind of how it is. But on the CFO side, it's kind of very much more of a kind of a business CFO than sort of a controller type CFO. Someone who would be, I think, in all of those companies, kind of a mature business partner for the CEO.
Very good. Now, Kris, obviously you also work with startups, as far as I understand, which is highly appreciated. But now, of course, you've seen the development of Wolt through scale up now to, well, being part of DoorDash listed company in the US. I mean, do you think that, you know, there are characters that can sort of grow from the startup phase and sort of operate and grow to be sort of CFOs in the size of business that Wolt is, or is it typical that there are actually changes along the way in the different stages? Or how do you see the evolvement of the CFO's role and sort of personalities through the different stages of growth?
Well, maybe let me start with how I introduce myself typically. I call myself the chief janitor, not the CFO. And that's because in a later stage company as a CFO, you have to be comfortable to move from strategy to deciding who's going to sit where in what building, because typically some of the more contentious decisions, like founders or CEOs try to kind of pun that off to the chief janitor. So you have to have a certain level of maturity, but also be confident enough to make decisions that, go from compliance all the way through, which buildings, like how do you do purchasing type of stuff. You end up like managing a lot of functions until you then get to an even later stage where you then functionalize things, like you get a global procurement leader, and then you don't have to worry about processes around what do we buy and cost controls anymore, because you actually have a function doing that. But it's very much the evolution from where you said you start with a Swiss Army knife, a person that is comfortable doing lots of things, from the admin stuff to kind of having good dialogues with founders, to then build up that organization. And the type of people that you need will change. The way I describe the journey is typically you need to have the Swiss Army knives, which I call doers. And then you have to have doers that can lead, and then you have to have leaders that can, the doers that can lead as you evolve and grow. And so the shift from a skill set perspective is very much from a Swiss Army knife to becoming a leader of leaders. And that's a transition that's not always easy, and it really depends on the scale, right? Like you'll probably have companies in your portfolio where you're in different grades of scaling and where you think the types of people that you need. But the evolution is truly from a Swiss Army knife to a person that can actually lead an organization, speak to an organization. The thing that becomes more important as a CFO is that you back up the storytelling. I think a lot of the role evolves from the basic things like building the systems, the processes, being a strategic partner to a founder, to also do the storytelling. Where's the company going? What's the strategy? How do you get there financially? What are the goals? Like how do you try to translate goals into actions? How do you follow through? How do you check on whether you're actually achieving those goals? And then doing the storytelling. A lot of what the role of a CFO becomes is also kind of like instilling the morale of employees. You have to keep the company exciting, and you can't do that in a boring presentation with going through your balance sheet. You really have to have that strategic conversation and support like the leaders of the company on telling where the company is going, to kind of pull the organization alongside of that. And then the other thing that I said that becomes like that I think that becomes really important is picking the right people.
Yeah.
Like the skill set of who you need. Your first controller is not going to be, the chief accounting officer of a larger company. Like typically doesn't, like most people don't scale. Some do, right? They can learn. But that transition from doers to doers that can lead, and then for people that can lead leaders type of stuff is it's a journey that you go on.
Cool. Well, I mean, following from that, I mean, obviously now and in the earlier presentations as well, I mean, CFO's role is really becoming more and more sort of a strategic leadership role. And now, for a number of good reasons, we are talking about company culture, right? But typically company culture is, I mean, I think yesterday there was sort of an HR strategic talk. I think there was lots of talks about company culture. But what about CFO? What is CFO's role, or is there a role in developing company culture? And so, Kris, if you start from your perspective, I mean, how do you see that?
I'm going to use a bad word. It's because I can't describe it differently. Like the one thing that, as you're picking the leadership bench, but also anyone that you have in the hiring process, is what you want to avoid is what I call the assholes in the room. It's people that think for themselves, that are land grabbers, that are always being political type of stuff. You want people that feel ownership, feel accountable for the company. And that's part of how you kind of shape culture. People need to feel like they have ownership. That's why I also believe in an equity model, to give as much equity to employees as you can, to make sure that they feel that co-ownership, and then show up thinking about the company but not themselves, and then surround themselves with people that behave in a very similar way. So for me, the basic simple rule is avoid the assholes. There's a TED Talk out there that I thought was very enlightening. I think it's Simon, I forgot his last name, He does a lot of public speaking.
Simon Sinek, maybe?
Yes, correct. That's the one. You might find it if you Google it up. But he had this like simple chart, and it's something that from an HR processes perspective, I've always truly believed in, is that you can measure people on performance, the things they do, kind of high performing, they do high delivery, they execute incredibly well, and then you have a trust factor. Like, do you trust that person? Do you think that person's going to have your back, or are they actually out there for themselves? Are they out there to kind of make a name for themselves, land grabbed? And if you look at Navy SEALs and how that works, if you ask Navy SEALs, they love all the people that execute, that do a great job. What they don't want to go is they don't want to go into battle with a person that they don't trust. They'd rather pick a person that is lower in execution, but that they can trust that's going to have their back. And that trust factor in making sure that you pick the right people is incredibly important. And it's basically to avoid the assholes in the room.
Cool. Then Ville, I mean, how do you see? I mean, of course, I mean, you make investments. Do you study the company culture? Does it matter? And again, sort of, in your opinion, does CFO have a role in building and developing company culture?
A big role, obviously. Yeah. It's depending on the company, but one of the top, 2-3 roles in each company, and that has a kind of a big responsibility for the overall leadership, including culture. And it doesn't just go to the sort of CFO's team, but through the management team for the whole organization. And I kind of always say that the flywheel works so that you need to first have the right people, then you need to kind of give the right experience for those people so that they're happy. And then you will get happy customers and more growth, and that will give you then the rewards that we want to have on the long-term basis. And the CFO is pretty integral in that field.
Cool. And what about Kim, making startup investments? Is it sort of, do you firstly or primarily look at the idea, or do you look at the team? And after that, in the startup phase, what is the role of CFO developing the company culture, or do you care?
I think that I nowadays first look at the market potential.
Okay.
If I would have done that in the past, I wouldn't have invested, for example, a statistical system for the junior ice hockey, which was a really stupid idea where the market is like 100,000 euros. So I invested few 100,000 euros for the market, which is size is 100,000 euros. Doesn't much make. But the culture part, that the startup companies have a really loose culture when it comes to the titles. It's more loose when it comes to titles than in Cuban army. And in Cuban army, actually, if you see the guys, they have medals all over the place. So in a startup company, anybody can be a CFO, even though they don't even understand debit and credit, besides in a credit card, more or less. And it's really worrying. In a very beginning, that whoever comes CFO is that who they want to sacrifice first, because money is such a dull thing, and marketing, that's a great thing. You can spend money, and sales, you can entertain people with the company credit card. And then you have the dull person who can be the CFO. I think that every company has, from day one, it has a culture. And I would be really worried if the CFO would be creative, because that kills companies. Hey, we are creative with how we do our bookkeeping, for example. And then, as Kris said, that you have to have the leaders and doers. And the challenge is following. Not all the people scale. And in a startup scene where I come from, the thing is that the title CFO is given to someone who doesn't scale up. And then comes the limiting factor for the company growth. And because the CFO is like ultimate title in a finance, that you can't put anyone on top of him or her. That if you want to put someone on top of her or him, it should be called like Master of the Universe. And that's more or less only title which is higher than CFO. So let's be careful with the titles.
Very good.
Sorry, that's an incredibly valid observation. Like building a company, like don't dole out titles. Like from the very beginning, be super careful. like call it a head of finance or a finance manager.
Yeah,
or like
just a controller. I always say try to find a controller.
Something like that, because like before you know it, a person has the title, and indeed there's no way out. Like you have to start working around the person, layering them. You hire a COO that has a really great financial skill set and then is managing the CFO. Like it becomes quite complicated. So you have to be very, very careful who you put in, what titles that you give, and be very stingy on titles, because you end up working around people, and that's. And
you end up with this person who just cares for him or herself. That even though that I can't do the job, but they are unwilling to let someone to lead them, then you're stuck. Even though the person could be really valuable for the company overall, but then you can't recruit anybody on top of him or her, and then it comes a limiting factor.
Yeah. I'll just add there that there's in a lot of the cases where we invest and we have this 5-year time horizon, and we have for the strategy we had the organizational design, and usually that includes recruiting someone who has kind of the CFO skills for the next 5 years. And for that journey, when we are kind of recruiting, if it's not an internal hire, when we're recruiting for that role, we always talk about what the organization will look like now and what it will look like in 5 years. Because there can be a lot of CFOs from very large companies, and they said, yeah, the first thing is that I'm going to recruit, 2 accountants and one internal controller and one guy doing the BI. And they're like, well, that might be in 5 years' time, but now we need someone who can do this phase. There's going to be one controller, and we're going to kind of move up the ladders. So you need to have the right person for the job that is present for the next 2 years.
Very good.
You need a janitor.
Yes,
yeah.
I like that, janitor. Yeah, Ville, you talked about now and future. So as a last item, let's talk about that a little. I mean, after, in my opinion, several really odd years where money didn't have value, so there were no interest. But as sudden we have returned back to normal. So now there is an interest, and everybody's all surprised that what should we do now? I mean, obviously. Especially in the scale-ups. We talked about lots of split scaling just a couple of years ago, and I think that Wolt was one of the companies in Finland who managed to make it to that scale, and and we are all impressed by the development. But how do you see it now, Kris? I mean, with the high interest rates and again a bit more uncertain future as it always is. Is the times of split scaling gone, or is it, and if you're looking from your perspective, is it different to manage the finance now during these times, or is it the same old?
That's a hard question. Like nobody really has a crystal ball. If you would have asked me 6, 7, 8 months ago, I would have probably said, you got to be really, really careful with every decision that you make, any capital allocation, how you grow, like where do you decide to put your capital? Because we didn't really know where the world was going to go, right? Like we have a war ongoing, high inflation, interest rates are going up. In a really perverse way, I feel myself quite comfortable that there's a new level of certainty. I know the world feels a bit shitty out there, and everybody's worried. But in times of uncertainty, when that uncertainty becomes stable, you can start planning again. So we know that we're going to have high interest rates, that there's going to be issues, potentially a recession, who knows. But you can start planning for that. Like you can feel more comfortable, it's stabilized. So we're in a bit of a dip, but you can start planning ahead. And then it's a matter of being very, very conservative with how you allocate capital. That's also what investors are going to be looking at. The story has gone from growth, and I know that the size of the market and the market potential is incredibly important. But how do you get growth, and the capital efficiency of how you go after growth matters. So that's the shift. How you think about scaling and split scaling, I think it's just different capital efficiency decisions that you have to do.
And following that, I mean, both Kim and Ville, you are allocating capital. And so how do you see, is it different now with the current circumstances, or, I mean, are you more cautious, or do you see more opportunities with the...
I think that the founders in startups, they were more bankers than entrepreneurs for a long time. And I love this because now we are back to normal. They have to manage with less resources, be more creative, more efficient. But I don't understand this moaning about that we have a high interest rates, because interest rates can be fairly well, can be seen for last 5,000 years. And what we had a few years back, it was exception. if it's 4 points, I don't see that's a problem.
Yeah, for us, we do make new investments. We're looking at those. We're also making exits. So we are active in kind of both sides of the market and continue to do so. Obviously, there's always in bad times a little bit of more timing consideration for those, but definitely kind of our shop is open and we are cautiously, like Kris said, that with all those decisions that how this new reality is impacting those companies' future.
In a certain way, it gets a bit easier to make decisions because people are being more rational. If you look at the irrationality, like if you like still today competing with Wolt with different competitors out there in the different countries that we operate in, like the capital that they're still spending to actually buy growth is irrational. And we were all competing for that with no real, like some of them don't have a plan to become profitable at all. Like they're trying to buy the growth and they're worried about the exit.
Yeah, that's great because I have portfolio 2 companies which are spending now 50 to 70% less, but they grow with the same pace.
Yeah.
So on that positive note, I think our sort of allocated time is pretty much done. I don't know if Peter or the audience have questions, but I guess I pass the buck to Peter. So,
Artti and the guys, thank you very much. Excellent panel, very interesting. I would have loved to hear you even more, as all of us would have most certainly done. But thing is, we don't have questions on the chat, and we have managed to manage the timetable fairly well, just a few minutes over time. So I think it's a perfect, you know, CFOs have to be very exact as well. So I mean, let's shut shop here, but excellent. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Super good.